I'm here to talk today about building connections in the literacy and education community. And if you look at the slide, you'll see I'm from Google, which is not a literacy organization, nor is it a community-based or educational organization. But either in terms of personal projects that people at Google do or company-wide initiatives, there definitely has been stuff that Google's been doing with organizations in the educational sphere. And in the case of the Literacy Project, which is what I'm going to talk about today, this started off as a personal interest and project that then led to a collaboration with UNESCO's Institute for Lifelong Learning and with LitCam, which is an international literacy campaign based in Germany. But before I talk about the project, I want to take a step back and give a little bit of context and talk about literacy and illiteracy on a global level. If I can make my slide go forward. There we go. Now, according to UNESCO, there are more than 770 million people in the world who are illiterate. So more than 2/3 of those people are women and girls. And more than 3/4 of those people live in the poorest countries in the world. But illiteracy isn't just a problem for the developing world, I think, as a lot of us tend to think. In industrialized nations, it's also a big problem, though it tends to manifest in something that's called functional illiteracy. Now, there are a billion definitions out there about what functional literacy is. The easiest way to think about it is whether or not someone can process basic printed information in the home or in the workplace. And when you look at, say, places like Germany, Great Britain, France, depending on which country you pick, you can come up with anywhere between 3 and 6 million people that are functionally illiterate. And the difference here is being able to understand something like this, but not being able to understand or read the newspaper. And in fact, in my own country, the US, by some estimates, there's more than 1/3 of people in Washington, D.C., which is the nation's capital, that are in fact functionally illiterate. So that's 1/3 of people who actually can't read a voting ballot. Now, I think another important thing to throw out here, which is something that Rebecca touched on earlier as well, is that there's so much talk about the internet being this hugely democratizing, beneficial force. And, I for one buy into that. But I think at the same time, it's really important to say that if you can't read, the internet's a pretty useless tool. And if you think that as more and more information comes online, and in some cases, online becomes the only point of entry for a lot of information, then it doesn't matter how many mobile phones you have and how many PCs increase in the world. Basically, there's a chance that the digital divide will only increase. Now, what we did in 2006 was sat down, thinking of this problem, but also trying to think of all the different issues that all the different groups working in this sphere, tackling, say, functional literacy as well as illiteracy. We sat down with UNESCO's Institute for Lifelong Learning and LitCam and tried to think, what can we do to support the organizations that are working in this area? We weren't trying to go and create projects or guidelines or tell people how to do things, but rather figure out how to support the work that was already out there. So this led us to create the Literacy Project. Now the idea was, again, to create a support system for the organizations that are working in this area. So educators, teachers, organizations, and parents. And to design something that would allow them to really exchange ideas and tools and resources. And the reason that we did this was, when we started off to create this, we took a step back and said, what do all these organizations have in common? And what are some of the big differences that we have to keep in mind? So if you look at the differences, for example, one of the things you're going to see is that when you're talking about developing nations, a lot of times you're talking about programs that are focusing on illiteracy, and as a result are focusing primarily on women and girls, because they represent the vast majority of illiterates. If you're looking at programs in industrialized nations, you're talking more about functional literacy programs, and the vast majority of functional literates in industrialized nations are boys. So your approach might differ in that sense. Likewise, there's obviously going to be differences based on language and culture. You're not necessarily going to teach literacy or functional literacy the same in, say, Japan as you would in Uganda, as you would in the UK. I think that's all fairly intuitive. Now, on the similarity side, what we found was really interesting was that looking at, regardless, across the board, whether we're talking about literacy or functional literacy, organizations I shouldn't say all, but a huge number of them have the family as a real core element. So family literacy programs that start with really from family-based and parent-based education. And another big similarity was the fact that what we saw over and over again was the amount of what we call the reinvention of the wheel. And I think a lot of us who've worked in nonprofits before are quite familiar with this. And I can't tell you the number of times that I saw an organization working maybe 50 miles or 500 miles from another organization, doing nearly the same kind of project, unbeknownst to each other, and both of those organizations starting from scratch and not sharing materials or ideas at all. And that's then how this project was born. The idea is provide the resources, provide the platform, get people to share information, get people, and above all, get people to share tools and projects so we can avoid this reinvention of the wheel. Now, I won't go through every single part of the site because I think that would take a little too long, and you can do that on your own if you'd like. But what we basically provide in a couple quick slides are resources for books, scholarly articles, book clubs, reading, so forth, all based on, say, literacy or reading promotion. And it ranges from, again, this group of really focusing on illiteracy all the way over to the functional literacy group. So again, you have, say, summer reading club type blogs, as well as blogs, say, that are being run by researchers or school teachers working in rural environments. Likewise, one of the things that the organizations we spoke to asked for was a more refined or narrow way to find literacy-related materials. So one of the big complaints or concerns we heard when we first started talking to other organizations working in this area was that when they would go to find literacy-related information, they found that actually the web was way too big for them, and it was very difficult to navigate. So what we've done is we've actually narrowed it, and we've created a search engine that is based just around literacy and reading-related sites. So it only crawls, only looks at those sites. The idea being to give you much more relevant results. So pretty much on any search engine, if you were to do a search right now for literacy or literacy Kenya women, the first few things that you're going to get are going to be definitions. And after that, probably some news articles as well. But in this site, you should only be getting results that are coming from relevant organizations. Because most people working in this area probably already know what, say, the word literacy means. So this is just an example of a set of results just searching for the word literacy. And I don't think you can see very well. But if you were to look at it, you would see that it's all related to actual reading-related sites that should lead you to further, say, research or projects. Another area we did was we looked at videos. And I think videos are a really interesting area because a lot of times when people talk about literacy or talk about reading promotion, they tend to think of only the offline or only the printed text. And what we've seen instead is that organizations are really, really active on the video front, increasingly so. And the videos range, there's sort of three buckets that you could throw them into. On one hand, you have, and this tends to particularly come from institutional and larger NGO type organizations, you have best practice videos. So this is the project we had, this is how we did it, how we rolled it out, these were the challenges, and so forth. In the middle book, you have the how-to, and that tends to come from educators, from teachers, from parents, how to most effectively read to a child, say, in the classroom or at home. And in the final bucket, you've seen increasingly number of free and open e-learning resources. So one really great example is an organization called Planet Read in India. And what they do is every week they broadcast, both within India and also on YouTube and a whole bunch of video platforms, videos with the same language subtitling in 10 different Indian languages. And the idea is they take a Bollywood video, do the same language subtitling, and basically provide subconscious reading practice in order so that people watching can match the spoken to the written word without ever really feeling like they're having to invest much time or pain. We also have a map, and what's been interesting about the map and seeing the number of organizations that have plotted themselves on the map is that it's gone beyond just a basic contact form of people trying to be able to find each other either at the local or international level. But it's also become a project database. And so what's really nice about this is that, for example, if I'm sitting in Colombia and I really want to try and see what other people have done with, say, early literacy programs in the equivalent of elementary schools around the 10, 11-year-old age, I can search through the box and discover that outside of Colombia, in many other countries, actually, I'll show the next slide. There, in fact, have been quite a few. And here I just zoomed in on one of them. But I get the full project description, for the equivalent of early literacy or autodidacción básica. And then I can just scroll up, get the contact information, or in an ideal world, hopefully the organization has also included the links to the free material that they're making available. Now, while this has gone really well so far, at the same time I think there's some really important challenges, and that also came up in the education stream as we were talking about open content. Now, one is global cooperation. Every organization I've spoken to is completely open to the idea of information sharing, best practice sharing, resource sharing. They love it. But when it comes down to it, there's a real kind of reality, particularly in the industrialized nations, that a lot of these organizations are competing for local funding. So even though they'd be happy to create the best practice video, say, and show people how they did it, they're far more reluctant to actually share the materials in the textbooks that they created to do it. We found that to be less of an issue with some of the organizations that are actually working in the developing world, in part because it's far more rare that they've actually been able to have the resources to create the materials. But when they have done so, it's maybe because there is less local competition. We haven't seen as many barriers in terms of them sharing that material. Next, I think, is a pretty obvious point. Linguistic diversity obviously limits the amount of sharing you can do. And it's a really big issue because, just in the case of our site, it's available right now in 3 languages. Now you can imagine that obviously we'll try and localize it, have it available in more languages, that you could eventually have translation software and translation wrappers to make, say, project descriptions more easily available to people who don't speak the languages in which the interface is currently available. But that doesn't necessarily help with the actual project materials themselves. Localization on that level, where it's not just trying to get a rough idea of the project done, but the actual materials, obviously requires significant resources from, say, the country which is receiving the materials. And likewise, it's also, I think, even bigger issue when you talk about the countries which would most benefit from free materials. In a lot of those countries, you're talking about potentially, if you think of Africa, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of languages. So the final one is, I think, interesting for people that particularly work in on the technology space as well, which is what I just call show me versus tell me, which is basically the problem that a lot of the organizations, or the organizations all have varying levels of media, say, savviness. And so some organizations are perfectly happy to search for other projects and really just kind of dig it around and try and figure out what works best for them. But a lot of organizations would really much prefer to receive, a piece of paper that has 4 projects on it with a big stamp of approval and work off of that. And I think that's something that time will sort, but it is an issue right now. But overall, we're really, I personally am really excited with what at least I think is the kind of conversation that's happening through the site. We have over 500 organizations in the past year that have thrown themselves onto the map, that are now talking to each other and actively contributing. And then thousands more that are either contributing to the site or hopefully pulling resources from the site. And before I let everyone go and eat, which I know is a pretty exciting proposition, I wanted to just show one project that's actually available through the site that is done by an organization called CAST. Because I think, again, a lot of us tend to think of literacy as an offline, printed material thing. And what CAST does is they take public domain works, put them online, and then build supports around them. And their idea is, okay, rather than create 10 different versions of Moby Dick, right? The version for the person with dyslexia, the version for the person who's visually impaired, the version for the 20-year-old who's reading at the 10-year-old level and for whom we're going to create a comic book version and possibly embarrass in front of his classmates. Instead of doing all that, let's create a free, open, and widely distributable book. So here you can see they've done the Call of the Wild. And I think it's a little difficult to see, but if you were to look at the top, they have hypertext, contextualized definitions. So you click on the word, and you're actually going to see what the word means within the paragraph and the context in which it's used, not 15 definitions that link off to another page and you don't know how to navigate it. They have text-to-speech narration. And then they have, depending on the inputs that the teacher or educator or parent has put in, they have different levels of supports and reading prompts and questions. And it's just a really, really interesting way of kind of looking at some of these questions of how do you scale technology? How do you make technology and books and literacy reach people that say only have sporadic internet access, or that wouldn't ever be able to afford those 10 different variations of the book. So I definitely encourage you to check this one out. It's at cast.org. But as for the project itself, I'd be happy, and I would love to hear any ideas that you have about it, or likewise if you're working on any similar projects. You can reach me at that email. So thank you.